Good afternoon, distinguished participants and viewers of the International Financial Congress. I am glad to welcome you at this session entitled Green Finance for Green Growth. We're going to talk to our distinguished speakers about this issue. First, we have Elena Kuritsina with us, Director of the Corporate Relations Department, Bank of Russia. Portfolio Advisor of East Capital, David Nichols. Ekaterina Trofimova, partner, head of financial institution services in Russia and the CIS Deloitte, and also Denis Shulakov, first vice president of Gazprom Bank. Speaking about green growth and environmental agenda, we refer first and foremost to the issue of climate change, which is becoming a threat. Increasingly, last year became the second hottest year on record, probably even the hottest one, together with 2016. It all depends on the methodology for calculating the average temperatures, but it turns out that the two hottest years fall on the 21st century, and this is due to man-made activities, especially if we compare that to pre-industrial era. Right now, the goal is to prevent the temperature from growing above 2 degrees centigrade, because as the World Meteorological Organization says, that's very dangerous, but locally this threshold can be broken, and there is a 20% chance of that in several places of the world. Yes, there are extreme weather phenomena, temperature records, and other problems, and climate change also brings with it a warming of the world ocean, melting of glaciers. There is a risk of inundation and also forced migration of people, and the temperature is becoming increasingly volatile. It can have different impact on different regions. There are different calculations. Some believe that several places will benefit from the global warming, but mostly, on average, the world is going to lose. And the IMF estimates that should the surface continue to become hotter by 0.04 degrees, then it will have a terrible impact on the world GDP. It's going to decrease by 7% by 2100. If we manage to slow it down, then the impact on the world GDP is going to be up to just 1%. But before we move on to a more detailed discussion about green finance instruments, I would like to ask all speakers to just briefly share your view with us. Do you think the financial market is capable of making a huge contribution right now to the fight against global warming? Elena, let's start with you. Yes, Ekaterina, thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. I would like to say unequivocally, yes, it can do that. But, it's not about whether it's yes or no. It's yes because there is no alternative, there is no other choice. Experts differ in their view as to how much money is going to be required to achieve this energy green transition. The estimates differ, but, it's to the tune of hundreds of billions of rubles, and national budgets are not going to be able to achieve that without attracting the resources of the market. David? Yes, absolutely, yes. There are different leverages, different levers, but from the point of view of investors, we believe that the most important thing is engagement. We've got to talk to companies. We've got to clearly communicate to them our expectations. We have BP, Exxon, Glencoe, other Western companies that have achieved a lot. But Russian companies also listen to investors, and they have already managed to make a lot of headway in that regard. Yes, I think it's an unambiguous yes. We're all unanimous in that regard. We believe banks are already playing, and they will continue to play, an important role in this economic transformation. As has been aptly said, these changes will require colossal investment. The banks won't be able to stand aside. But for banks too, this is yet another opportunity to revisit how they see their business, how they can manage risks. According to Deloitte calculations and studies, in the next 3 years, Russian banks think that in 40% of cases, climate change will have a direct bearing on their financial outcomes. So it is also about, financial stimulation of what they're doing. Yes, thank you. And Dennis, I have to join everyone who has spoken before me, but I'd like to highlight 2 points. First, financial markets represent the biggest source of investment. And there is another aspect to financial markets, what Ekaterina has drawn our attention to. It's about syndicating your risks. Right now, companies sometimes voluntarily, sometimes they are forced to do that, but they accept sustainable development principles. They improve and revisit their strategies for development. And if they do that, then the market will show that they're going to be more competitive. Yes, I'm very glad to see this unanimity. Right now, I would like to ask our audience, when you think about investing your own money, your own assets, what is the most important consideration? Are you willing to forego high profitability, knowing full well that you make a contribution to your future? This is the question we would like to ask you. Yes, no, I won't forego profitability. Yes, if the profitability is around 5%. Yes, if we lose just 1 percentage point, and the last is yes, because that's more important than the figures. It's not about the figures. So no, yes, from 0.1 to 0.5. From 0.5 to 1, and it's not about the figures. Elena, I'd like to ask you the following. Right now, many economies are redirecting money into greening the economy. The banks cannot stop the climate change because they do not have the necessary toolkits, but as financial institutions, they can mobilize the efforts that are required and resources that are required to transition to a low-carbon economy. So what are Russian banks already doing in that regard? Yes, the regulators, of course. Thank you very much for this question. I believe the Bank of Russia is one of the first government authorities that has started to look very closely at the climate agenda back in 2013. We understood that there probably would exist a need to introduce green social instruments into the financial sphere, and we had the arrival of first instruments in 2020, and in 2022 we published recommendations for social investors, the recommendations of responsible investment. I believe David knows about that, everything, and he'll probably share with us more details afterwards. As the regulator for the financial market, the Bank of Russia, if we look at what we can do to improve funding for sustainable development, well, in that sense, the Bank of Russia focuses on instruments, on financial instruments. As I said, green bonds and social bonds started to be issued in 2020, and we see that this segment is growing. In 2020, this segment grew several times as compared to previous year. And right now, we have seen already 13 batches of such bonds on the Moscow Stock Exchange. But of course, if we compare us to the Western experience, we will see that there is still a lot of room to grow. We still have a long way to go because, the figures in the West are incomparable to what we have in Russia, according to CBI. To cite an example, that's the Climate Bond Initiative. As of the end of 2020, that was $1.1 trillion. By June 2021, the figures have risen to $1.3 trillion. And these are just the green bonds. And if you take the overall investment into sustainability, then it's going to rise to the amount of more than $2 trillion. If we try to come to grasp, to grips with, these figures, we see it's enormous capital. And as you can see, the financial market is already playing an important role in funding the climate and the energy transition. Definitely, as far as Russia is concerned, we still have a long way to go. We've got to push forward. I have to tell you that we are going to experience more difficulties than European countries due to the simple reason that we see lower demand for sustainable tools, for sustainable business on the part of investors, both institutional investors and household investors. So far, Russia does not have this conscientious demand created by the population for investment, for responsible investment, for responsible behavior. We will have to work on that so that investors come to realize how important that is, so that investors, and responding to the question that you've put on the screen, would say that it's not about the figures, it's about how our children and grandchildren will live 50 or 100 years hence. The Bank of Russia takes part in developing the regulation for these instruments. Recently, we have published the amendments to the rules for issuing green and social bonds. Given the forthcoming changes, given the national taxonomy of green and social projects that is going to be introduced, given the forthcoming implementation of national identification system, we believe it is possible to liberalize to a certain extent the issuance of green bonds. These bonds could be easier to issue, they could become more accessible too, and we are hopeful that by the end of summer we will be able to adopt these amendments. And we also want these regulations to fit with the regulations that the Ministry of Economic Development and the VEB have come up with. I refer to the documents on the green taxonomy in particular. There is another avenue we are pursuing, trying to stimulate new instruments. We are also working on a green mortgage. We believe it's an important avenue to be pursued. We can see that there is huge potential we can tap there, and it's also of great significance to our population because it does not simply boil down to finance. It is about the health of people who live in where they live. It's about their quality of life, quality of their sleep, and other health-related aspects. So, together with the Ministry of Construction, we asked the ministry to set up a working group that would set forth the standards for green construction, green buildings. We cannot talk about green mortgage until we have introduced a certain level of regulation with regard to what should be qualified as green construction and what shouldn't. And the third, most importantly, the issue of stimulation, the issue of how exactly the government is going to support the development of this market. On many occasions, we have said that so far we are not willing to talk about any specific measures of prudential stimulation. But, of course, Russia has signed the Paris Agreement, so Russia has committed itself to stimulate the redirection of capital flows into funding sustainable development. So, accordingly, Russia has to come up with a way of stimulating the issuance of such tools. We have drafted a number of proposals which we submitted to the Ministry for Economic Development. We believe we could focus on tax-related measures, as we have seen tax preferences for bonds placement have had a significant impact on the growth of this market. Unfortunately, these measures have already been phased out, but we believe that if we reintroduce them, they could support the nascent market of green and social bonds. Of course, there can be other instruments such as subsidies and coupons, on bonds, and also on verification. Verification can be very pricey, and we intend to discuss our proposals during the next session of the working group under the direction of the Ministry for Economic Development. When can these stimulation measures be introduced? For them to be implemented, we will need a decision by the government, and if these are going to be tax-related measures, then we need to have amendments to the tax code, and it's going to be a lengthy process. You know, when we hear about the colossal sums that are already being invested into green projects, I always think, how do we make sure that the money is used for the right purposes, and how do we distinguish between good purposes and bad ones? That is a very apt question. In order to understand what is good and what's not a good purpose, for that, and we create this green taxonomy. Until recently, both we and our issuers were using European approaches when designating green projects or socially sustainable projects. As previously mentioned, the Ministry for Economic Development has been working together with WRF, and it has come up with the draft national green taxonomy and a national taxonomy of green projects. We expect these documents to be endorsed by the government in the near future, which will launch this system at the national level. It is encouraging that our national taxonomy is in full compliance with the European taxonomy. It's different just in one part, because it's country-specific. We believe that nuclear power projects fall within the green category, whereas the European countries are still engaged in a discussion, and so far they do not include nuclear power projects into the green category. So another thing, in order to understand where the money is being distributed and channeled, we have established a national global system, the verification system, that authenticates that the actions of the issuer meet the promises, that indeed the money the issuer has got through placing these green bonds are going to be used for green projects. And this verification system is going to be upscaled. So those verification institutions are third parties. They're not government agents. No, not the government. These can be auditors, or these can be consulting agencies that specialize in verification in environment, sustainable development. And they are genuinely independent. Their role is very close to that of an auditor, but the auditor verifies your financial reporting, whereas these verificators authenticate that truly the money has been used for the purposes promised by the issuer when the bonds were issued. So you can see where the money has been invested. And do you understand what is going to happen to those who do not fulfill their promises and invest in other sources? Yes, there are instruments for that. If an issuer has issued green bonds promising to channel them, and then, the verification process has taken place, then the project prepared by the ministry and VEB, this document stipulates that verification has to happen once a year or more often, depending on the terms of the issuance, and then it turns out that the money has been used to buy a yacht, for instance, or for other pleasant things, then the consequences ensue. And these green bonds are no longer considered as green. They are excluded from all government support measures. Moreover, we will require that this issuer is excluded from the prospectus of green bonds issuance. They should be excluded from the relevant registry at the Moscow Stock Exchange. And the documents on the issuance also have to contain some sanctions with regard to the bonds themselves, either, pay back before the deadline. We are still talking about that, and we believe that the issuer can set these terms on its own. It can be a raise in the coupon rate or other penalties that have to be included into the prospectus. Yes, thank you. Next, I would like to speak in greater detail about the Russian banks. As far as I understand, they have set the goal of greening their portfolios. They provide us with a range of green products. Recently, there was a study on how far ESG factors are taken into account by the banks. Ekaterina, could you please tell us what the outcomes are of this study? Is the Russian banking sector ready to serve as a catalyst for mobilizing the resources with a view to achieving an energy climate transition? Yes, thank you very much for taking note of this study. We did it at the request of the Association of Russian Banks. The association initiated this study, and, it was a very good thing from the point of view of Deloitte, because we are a global consultancy on ESG principles. We see that the Russian banks arrived here in this field with a certain lag, but right now the growth is explosive. Elena has cited some statistics, but let me share with you some Russian figures. If we look at the years ahead, then we will see an explosive growth of ESG assets, not just green assets. This will be accompanied by a greater regulatory interest, also by an increase in stimulation programs. There are going to be behavioral changes, and also the market is going to be increasingly interested in that. As Elena has said, we see a generational shift happening, and the expectations of consumers are shifting too. We feel that in retail. It's obvious. And, just shortly, on a separate note, I would like to say that usually the banks are the agents of everything new, interesting that comes from the Western markets. And interestingly, in this particular case, banks have been acting with a certain lag as compared to export-oriented companies. Banks have arrived late to this field of ESG principles. But still, be that as it may, it's important. So far, understanding is not that well developed. We do, however, have the requisite infrastructures, Elena has said, for the development of ESG instruments, ESG loans, ESG policies, but so far we do not have a comprehensive government framework for that. We do not have a taxonomy. These elements are only now emerging, nor do we have a system for economic stimulation, so it's going to be very interesting to know what the answer is going to be to the question that you posed to the audience. When we prepared this study, we ran into doubts as to economic feasibility of this development, and these questions remain. As of now, our Deloitte study demonstrates that only around 10% of Russian banks, and we have studied all Russian banks that existed back then. It was spring and early summer this year. We studied the banks that had licenses, and only 10% to an extent, just in some aspects, adopted ESG practices, or only 40% used the practices of corporate social responsibility. So to be blunt, right now, greening and ESG principles, this is usually what big companies are working on. And in our study, we pointed out that this is probably one of the factors that will have a bearing on the competitive environment. Given the complex nature of these processes, given the requisite transformations in operational management, in risk management, which will require additional investment. Given all that, we see that the gap might grow between the most advanced banks and other banks across the system. And on the whole, based on Deloitte experience, not just in Russia, but elsewhere too, first and foremost in other countries where this process is ahead of ours. So based on this experience, we see that the ESG transformation regime is playing an increasingly important role in assessing risks and in shaping markets. Interestingly, usually There are some classic factors that affect investors' price parameters for borrowing, and these are the assessments of credit risks.
Since mild loan situation in the world continues and low default rate persists, ESG loans become more attractive in terms of borrowing parameters on markets, and it is not impossible that if we continue living in this very mild situation, they will become even more relevant. So even in annual reports of many global organizations, we see that ESG disclosure factors come to the forefront, and we see lots of perspectives for that as well. This research has shown that less than 1% of Russian banks disclose any information about their ESG work. So that speaks for itself. We see that a lot is to be done. Under 20% of banks understand what ESG is, what green means. And most importantly, and it's a question to our colleagues, what do investors expect to see as they try to understand what ESG is and what to do about it? Nonetheless, we see growing interest towards the subject. It's underpinned by action. 15% of Russian banks note that they see demand on behalf of clients, on behalf of the market, demand for the development of ESG. Also, they note that over 30% in the 3-year period will be able to introduce ESG practices in their work. Banks are facing many challenges. To mention but one, lack of qualified experts. We don't have enough qualified people that would understand, not just understand in theory, but be able to apply in practice these principles. So we see the emergence of the market. And if there are young experts watching, life hack to you. This is a very interesting and also a very promising line of work where you could grow professionally, and there'll be more and more demand for such experts on the labor market. A few more words about potential. Until the year 2036, should existing trends persist, according to our estimate, ESG assets might exceed 360 trillion rubles. And by the year 2030, green loans, sustainable development-related goals might exceed 1.3 trillion rubles. So we're talking about a lot of money. We're getting questions from the audience. One has to do with green mortgage that Yelena mentioned and green deposits. Did you assess their prospects? Well, we think they're good prospects. These instruments are indeed developing very rapidly. But again, I don't want to give any specific price-related parameters on specific instruments, because objectively everything depends not just on consumer interest or bank interests, but it will very much depend on how regulators see risks. So it's a joint exercise of looking at the situation from all angles and trying to find good balance between risks and opportunities. So I want to note, the forecast I gave in terms of figures is rather long-term, because I think that this fine-tuning, which we're still going through, might be subject to trial and error. Yelena mentioned greenwashing, where you pretend that certain instruments are green, but they're not. Unfortunately, we've seen a number of such unfortunate examples, and likely we will see more of them in the future. But it's important to give this process a good start. This is what we're focusing on. I have a question to Dennis. It has been said that we've seen 13 issues of green bonds on the Moscow Stock Exchange. Are Russian companies interested in this instrument? And take into account what Ekaterina just mentioned. I mean, the situation with banks remains difficult, so what should be done in terms of regulation or interaction with Russian companies to achieve explosive growth of such green instruments on the Russian market, like what we see globally? I prepared a little slide to highlight what has been said by colleagues. And I think Ekaterina was very positive in her statement. So she said that the market sees this as a window of opportunity, not trying to escape from failure. But let us be realistic. Last year, ESG market grew by 231%. In the first half of this year, it grew by 84% as compared to previous year. In absolute figures, it doesn't look that impressive. I agree. We've seen 13 issues of green bonds, 4 issuance of social bonds. But this is not all the risk, because we're not taking into consideration 100 billion that we issued by Russian railroads, because back then they did not meet certain norms to be able to classify them under sustainable development, but they were very much in line with ICMA standards. So by international standards, they were green bonds. And also we're not taking into consideration Eurobonds. And a number of issues took place, and today local market is showing more progress than Russian companies entering foreign markets. If we look at Russian bonds, we'll see that Russian market accounts for 61% as opposed to 39% if we look at the volume of green bonds on the international market. And we need these statistics, although it's not as entertaining, but we needed to understand the phenomena. You mentioned interest, but if a company is set up, if it's not a charity foundation, it's set up to derive profit. And for that, it's either maximizing its financial results by raising volume of sales or by cutting costs. When a company seeks funding, it either is looking for the cheapest money there is on the market or is selling its risks at the lowest possible rate. So it's a two-sided task. So today when we talk about sustainable development and capital market, sustainable development-related requirements have become rather stable. So it is a window of opportunity, like I said, but we can look at it differently. With happy people, meaning people that work in this field, because this is something completely new. Let's look at countries that have set forth those targets. China decided to achieve net zero by 2060, and according to them that would cost 16 trillion. Europe said that by the year 2050 individual countries will achieve similar results, but at 3 to 4 trillion. But probably they're limiting timelines not to speed up inflation, but the Global Association of Capital made their calculations and saw that if we want to achieve net zero by 2050, 123 trillion is needed. I mean, we've never seen such calculations. We've never seen such windows of opportunity. And we're saying it is a great opportunity because in order to be able to switch to this economy, hydrogen economy, we need 3 times more electricity. Well, our president made a joke that you don't get electricity from the wall where your socket is. You need to produce this electricity. And this means we're likely to see explosive growth of fossil, hydro, and nuclear energy, although we need to reduce the share of fossil fuels, but still we need them at this point of time. So the big question is, how is that going to be funding? And sustainable, responsible funding becomes important. You will not get funding unless you meet all the criteria. You're asking whether Russian companies are interested. Well, COVID made people as they were in lockdown, made people think of what is it they do in life. We assess many of things in life. I just had COVID, and I can tell that as you get better, you try to think of all the positive things that keep you together. And so did the society. And Russian companies are no exception. They are equal participants of international markets, and we will have to take on board all these principles. Look at what the market did. It's on the left. We saw that in 12 months, there were a number of principles that were developed and integrated, and 2 standards were introduced, green bonds and social bonds. But the world does not stand still. Not all companies can be green. I mentioned extraction of natural resources. What are we to do now is to stop extracting in Siberia, and cities will be abandoned. Canada, France have similar problems. We're not alone in that sense. So people thought about it and came up with a different standard, saying, okay, green economy is where we're heading. But along the way, we need to make sure we don't lose faith. So we need to find a standard that would help us go through the transition. Sustainability-linked bonds constitute such standards that are based on KPIs related to this transition. The standard has not been introduced in Russia, but like Elena said, Central Bank is closely looking into it, and we're working on introducing the standard in Russia, and then 95% of our economy will be involved in sustainable finance projects. Last year, we introduced 2 new standards. If this year we're able to introduce those SLB bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and if we introduce sustainability criteria for a combination of sustainable and green products, and also transition bonds, that were created in order to prevent the situation where a company that has a large carbon footprint but wants to go green, I mean, that was banned. A company that is not green should not be allowed to issue green bonds, even for the separate green products. So a new standard was introduced, which has become institutionalized, and I'm sure that this standard will also be integrated in the Russian legal framework. And there's no alternative, because if we look at the lowest graph on the right, lowest diagram on the right, you'll see that this is a unique opportunity that comes from investor side. Investors that subscribe to sustainable financing principles. It's over 3,000 investors. Over 450 of them invest in Russia, so they're all on this list. As of July last year, half of assets managed by those investors should be placed in instruments that were created, taking on board ESG factors. And as of next year, the rumor has it requirements will go up to 90%. So if we make an aggregate, we'll say that the total money managed is 110 billion. So if we split it, if we check which part is accounted for by bonds, we'll see that amount of underinvestment is 8 to 10 trillion, and the requirement is 50 trillion. So we've never lived in a world where that much money would be looking to be invested in such instruments, and they can be nominated in domestic currencies. So we need to think of how we can get prepared to meet this change. Most important thing we need to do is to level or equal tax regulations for non-residents, that is, foreign investors, who could invest in Russian corporate bonds like they do in Eurobonds. You say it goes without saying, but it's not a given, no. Today, Russian investors, as they invest on the local Russian market, they have to pay higher taxes. So if we're able to deal with that, then we will welcome this global money on our market. This would be the largest resource we could use at this point of time. And this will add life to the economy and will make this transition possible for us. What else needs to be done? So we need to integrate new instruments in our legal framework. We need to make them more liquid, such as repo, mostly repo through central counterparty, and we have infrastructure in place. And we need companies that, some say we need companies that should be enthusiasts, front runners, but I don't think we really do. I think at some point, as people understand the situation, more and more of them will be ready to make a step. We've started this dialogue with over 60 Russian companies. We're currently working on 3 mandates. Look at Rosatom deal. The number 13 that under the sustainable development, it happened on the Russian market and was welcomed by the Russian market. We cannot say there's greenium on the Russian market where bond price would go down because it's by 5–10% just because it's green. But I can tell you that market has shown a lot of interest and the spread was very low.
Это 67 базисных пунктов. Вот вам результат. Спасибо вам огромное.
I have to interrupt because we're running out of time. Maybe, Elena, you would like to comment.
Очень коротко подтвердить, что действительно огромный интерес к переходным SLB продуктам.
That there's a lot of interest towards transition SLB products, and we, together with the Bank of Russia and market participants, are working on it, and hopefully by the end of the year would be able to implement those standards in the legal framework. And now I would like to ask to bring on the screen answers to our polls, and it's really interesting how people voted. The question was, what matters more when we decide on investment? 28% are ready to lose yield because it's important, and only 12% are not ready to lose yield. I think it's a very good split. So, David, you as someone who is responsible for investment,
Поскольку за рубежом это уже довольно большая традиция, да, устойчивые финансовые инструменты, есть на самом деле такая большая потеря доходности.
Would you really lose yield?
Фонды, которые, с одной стороны, ставят все больше целей себе по увеличению доли зеленых
foundations that try to increase share of green instruments in their portfolio, how do they strike balance between responsibility in front of their clients and in front of their clients, and clients care about yield, as you know. Well, we are from Sweden, and most of our clients have withdrawn from oil and gas sectors. Like I said, we really believe that if you want to achieve good results, engagement is very important. You need to convey your message across. And our clients understand and appreciate this approach. At the same time, they're smart people and they understand that ESG, climate change, is not just something we do for the sake of future generations, or in order to, look good, tick boxes, or make beautiful presentations. I think this change will have very significant impact on the cost of Russian companies, not in 10 years, but right now. In worst-case scenario, assessment of Russian companies, unless they apply those new practices, might drop by 50%. So I wouldn't say that yield should necessarily go down. And even if it does a little, it also helps reduce risks, which is very important for us and for all of our clients, especially since they're sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. They think long-term. And I want to add a tactical aspect that was mentioned. $50 trillion that have to be invested or need to be invested in ESG type securities. So if companies have ESG strategies, if they have good matrix, I think they will get better multipliers when trading as compared to other companies that do not have ESG strategy, that have bad matrices. So, no, I don't think it's a problem. Well, it's good thing that hopefully in the near future we will not have to make a difficult choice that our audience had to make. East Capital is an international foundation that invested in Russia and still investing in Russia. And you stayed through the difficult recent years. So do you think financial instruments could become a driver that would encourage other international foundations turn towards Russia? Yes, of course. Maybe not immediately, though. There are two things to keep in mind. If we look at regular instruments, such as equity, fixed income, and regular companies, I think metallurgy looks very interesting. We can argue a lot about oil and gas, about role of oil and gas companies. But demand for metals is huge, and it is needed for transition. So I strongly advise IEA Net Zero scenario, which is an interesting publication, but demand for metals is really promising. Look at nickel. Now it's in 10 years, the growth will grow 18-fold to 50-something billion. So we are looking for long-term structural opportunities, and so do other funds. So I think metallurgy offers great opportunities. But we know that these are active companies, so I think we'll get there. Thank you, David. We're still getting questions from the audience, from our virtual audience. So could you very briefly list advantages of green bonds, both for investors and for issuers? Well, for an investor, I can tell we promise our clients that we're going to be taking ESG principles into consideration, and if we fail to do so, will have difficulty. But for companies, there are also strong advantages because that changes culture of companies. It makes companies more conscious. And it's not just about ticking the box, because it really will, in the long term, make companies more successful. And the question to Yelena, when will the Bank of Russia publish recommendations on disclosure of non-financial accounting? Within the next 2 or 3 weeks max. We've done a lot of work with the market, and we're now finalizing this text with our lawyers. So apparently people are looking forward. And a question related to people that will be authenticating, talking about greenwashing. As far as I know, currently there are no requirements, and anyone can do verification. Indeed, it is the case. Right now, draft regulations that were produced by Weberov, that is being considered by government, are very liberal in terms of who can act as verificator, but WebRF will be a self-regulatory organization in a sense. It will execute certain control and supervision over what verificators do and how they operate. And if they see that someone does not meet the high standards, they would be able to stop this company from verifying further projects. But we understand it's just a first step. And if we see that this system needs to be fine-tuned and developed, it's not impossible that at some point we not as central bank, but as Russian Federation, we might switch towards regulation and public control and supervision. So we've run out of time. Just want to thank our speakers for being with us for the very interesting presentations, and thank all the audience, and wish you all the